Okay, this is a special sort of project. We are let's see here. Okay, so when you're dealing with, sorry about the nausea that's being induced here. Okay. There we go. Okay, so when you're dealing with a 6-scale female figure, they all come with a very flattering physique, like this, which is great. I'm sure that most people, most ladies, would not mind at all having their avatar um, represented in this sort of fashion. And it's great if you're dealing with a model that kind of looks like that, where it's very spicy, shall we say. And okay, but sometimes you might have a figure you want to make that is a little bit different. Okay, now for example, if you're working with a female figure and say most female figures, the neck attachment is already sculpted in. So where some male figures come with a pre-sculpted neck. Let's click on Dr. Strange here. Okay, so Dr. Strange here has a neck sculpted onto his head like this. Now, it looks very impressive, like because you can add detail to it. However, it limits posability. Now, there are other options where, like say for this Daredevil figure, you can see how the head and the neck is separate. It's sculpted on to the body itself, and now the head moves like this. This works particularly well if you're going to be doing action poses. Now, most modern female bodies come with the neck already attached, which is fine if you're dealing with just a typical figure. However, what happens if it's Halloween and you want to make a witch figure? Now, this rubber body looks like this, okay? And it fits over this endoskeleton here. And it just attaches on like that. It's very, very flexible. Sometimes it does tear, though, when you're taking these off. So my intention is to create a body covering, I should say, that is going to be more representative of maybe an older female figure. So there's going to be some detailing with the wrinkling in the neck, and there's going to be some detail with the breast, and there's going to be some adjustment to the midsection so that it's a little less than ideal. Okay? Kind of like they made a fat Thor figure, but they did not make a fat ladies figure. In fact, they're very, very difficult to find. It's interesting because you can get a decent variety of bodies for male figures. Like for example, like this here, like he's got a sort of larger torso. It's got a whole chubby. Worldbox actually made a figure a few years back called the Dad Bod, um, which had like a little paunch and sort of little, not not as large as that other one, but it's a little bit different. So my idea is like this is my second attempt at this. My first attempt crashed and burned. Um, so I'm going to do my best to try this again. Now, what I'm going to do is I took this body and I sort of blocked off the leg holes with it. I glued this together and held this in the proper shape as best I could. And I poured resin inside of it to create this framework to sculpt on top of, so that once I get that done, I, and again, this is my second attempt at it, I will have a uh, female bodysuit basically that can fit over top of this, and it's going to look a little bit differently. And the good thing about this is it's going to come in two pieces. So I will have um, an upper torso and a lower torso. See, these pieces go together this way, like this. So I'm going to primarily be focusing on this one to have a little bit of a different shape to it, a little less athletic, I guess we'll say. um, Primarily to represent age, uh, some sagging, some uh, less idyllic um, form, I guess we'll call it, like little less 17 model and a little bit more um, uh, I don't know, middle aged, I guess you would say. All right, so we're going to start with the lower torso first, and the reason being is that as we age, gravity beats us up pretty good, and so there's going to be some sagging and some drawing down. Um, it's kind of interesting. Like I was watching uh, Top Gun Maverick the other day. Fabulous movie, by the way. And uh, looking at Tom Cruise playing football on the beach, shirtless. And I got to say, for a guy who's pushing 60 years old, he looks great. He's about 5 years older than me, and he looks a lot better than I do, and I look pretty good for my age. Not saying I look great, but it's more a battle of attrition. Like you sort of win by default because most of the people that you are your age kind of let themselves go. So, um, but you notice that there is a definite and distinctive um, difference in just the body shape as we age. Men, for example, we just get thicker in the midsection. Not necessarily fat, because you look at Tom Cruise, he's not holding a whole lot of body fat on him, but there is some visceral fat that comes along in the midsection, and there's a thickening aspect as well that happens. And it's a similar thing with ladies, especially any woman who has had children. Um, and well, hey guys, yes, Canadian Spider Man, you are absolutely right. Tom Cruise's job is to uh, stay in shape, and he can afford to hire um, dietitians and trainers and things like that. How are you, Tim? Um, but yeah, it's doesn't necessarily represent reality though, and sometimes in our collections, our figure collections, it would probably be good to have someone who could represent a realistic thing. Now, I had originally started doing this idea um, several years ago when it got to be coming on to Halloween. And well, Canadian Spider-Man, since this is a polymer clay, I wonder if that sort of makes me a plastic surgeon of sorts. So anyway, uh, I wanted to make a witch figure that had like, um, it's funny because like we see a lot of Hollywood celebrities that are aging, and Botox apparently doesn't work on your neck. Um, and it's kind of apparent. So we notice that there's a lot of wrinkling and there's a lot of changes that happen in the neck area. And that's sort of like, yes, yes, a witch. Um, but I've noticed that like there was no opportunity for any kind of representation uh, in the action figure world. So I thought to myself, hey, you know what? Like everything else, it's sort of my motto. If you can't find it, make it. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to try and uh, make this, set this up a little bit so that we can actually uh, make a more realistic representation that might be out there. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start here, and we're going to work on, um, for lack of, shall we say, um, I think a matter of reality that we're going to look at. Okay, so there's going to be layers of fat. There's going to be like different deposits and different uh, features that we're going to see. Okay, so what I want to do is start to sculpt that. Now, one of the things you notice when you're dealing with a lot of these modern action figure bodies is that they tend to be a little hyper realistic. Like for example, there are some lines and some details, uh, very apparent sculpted, and this is moderate. This is very uh, excuse me one second. Mute this. Sorry about that. Had to take care of the dog. Okay, so we have to sculpt in some details here that are a little uncomfortable. Because as we know, nobody wants to be represented realistically. We would all much rather be represented in the most favorable light possible. Okay, so we're going to start at the bottom. So as we work our way up, gravity will push things down. So there's going to be layers of fat to kind of droop a little bit. Now, I don't want this figure to necessarily be obese, but what I do want is sort of a more realistic representation. Um, we're not really looking for um, graphic levels of detail. However, we may want to hyper emphasize a few things just because um, when you put, let's say for example, there's going to be multiple uses for this figure. Now, in a diorama setting, you may want to have a realistic representation of bystanders. Several years ago, I had a display of zombie figures, and um, which zombie figures are great, but um, what about their victims? They're going to be pursuing people, and like as he said in Zombieland, the first one to go were the fatties. They just couldn't quite run away from the zombies. So we're going to sort of work in like this a little bit. Yes, the next question will be how do you know what this looks like? Well, when I was in college in my drawing class, we um, we had nude models, and for the most part, our regular nude model was this young lady who was um, little punk rock chick with um, like a waffle design haircut, kind of pressed into the side of her head. Um, and she would come there, and her girlfriend was this girl who was like, if she wasn't a dwarf, she was pretty close. But man, did she have the permanent scowl on her face? Like she was watching everybody in that room, like to make sure they weren't checking out her girlfriend. Now, the first time that you have a live nude model, it it's a little uncomfortable um, because, like, you're not used to seeing like a naked woman in front of you for, unless it's like a more intimate setting, um, and but you get over it rather quickly when you know uh, the professor, who was an interesting guy. He was like 6'5" with a big goatee and a very high pitched voice. Um, and he always wore overalls. He looked sort of like a farmer mixed with Van Gogh. And his favorite reference was Nicolaides, who was an early Greek, um, as I understand, if my memory serves, uh, kind of like set up the first ideas of the first um, art instruction, basically. And he would talk like this. His voice was very high pitched, and he was, as Nicolaides taught us. Like, and the first couple weeks of class, it was pretty rough trying to get used to that voice. Um, so yeah, that was interesting. And anyway, so we had this little we'll call her the punk rock girl who would come in and be our live model. But one day she got sick, and I think her grandmother came in for her, who was probably in her 60s. And it was funny because, like, all the girls in the class started making fun of all the guys, like telling us like not to get too excited, and laughing at us like ha ha, and it was really sort of uh, demeaning to the model. Not that they were being like blatantly obnoxious or really overly loud in their statements, but they were definitely making some comments, uh, which is sort of like, you know, kind of typical. I worked at a couple places where like we had a largely female staff, and man, women are just brutal to each other. They can act really sweet to each other's face, but damn, the second one leaves the room, it's like, oh my god, did you go there? Like holy crap, it was um kind of brutal. I mean, they're like they pick each other apart. Um, Much worse than any criticism that men would offer. I mean, they get downright personal. But so anyway, the very quickly our professor started drawing our attention to things, and it was interesting because like I'm pretty sure the professor was gay, um, but and simply because, all right, so when you're an art major, especially on the East Coast here, um, you learn really quickly that a lot of the people around you are gay, and you get used to it very quickly, and they're no longer your gay friends; they're just your friends. And but it's very funny because uh, men, like straight men, are very cautious about like not hurting a woman's feelings. But in my experience, the gay men were like they really didn't care because there was like really nothing for them to gain by being kind and flattering. So they would be brutally honest. And so the professor, and I forget his name offhand, which I kind of feel bad about because although he was sort of a little strange and whatnot, he did really offer me a lot of insight that I hadn't taken thought of in my drawing before. Um, but anyway, so he started to point out as the models that were, he wasn't like approaching or anything, but he would like describe from a distance, like, look how wonderful all the layers of fat are, how they wrinkle and lay on each other. And I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable for this lady who's sitting there and being basically told she's kind of fat and saggy. Um, but I mean, when when you're dealing with art, and especially when you're trying to make an accurate representation of something, the first thing you have to do is be honest. Um, I found that the first thing you want to draw an honest or create an honest representation of what you're seeing, and then afterwards, after you get that base down of that honest representation, um, uh, you want to you can soften it any way you want. You can, but you have to start with the reality. So you start with like the reality of how the form looks, and then over time, what you'll do is to modify it according to your model. So it's kind of like what we're trying to do here. Now, what I want is sort of um, and yes, before I got on to this project, I did a little research. Thank God for Google. You have to be a little creative because of the way they filter things. Um, when you post like nude fat women and put that in your search bar. By the way, I recommend doing that in incognito mode so it doesn't get saved to your browser history. Um, it would be very awkward next time you go to place an order with Amazon and your browsing history comes up there and suggests to anybody who looks on your computer like, do you have a hobby here that I don't know about? Anyway, so it really is fascinating when you're doing sculpting work and even drawing um, to get in here and uh, try to recreate like things like uh, puffiness and to make it look organic. So it's looking much more uh, realistic as things lay. And I'm hoping that like, and I thought about this um, because when The Force Awakens came out and Hot Toys made their version of Princess Leia, looking like Carrie Fisher at you know in her mid 60s, late 60s, um, and she kind of prematurely aged her body with the amount of chemicals that she struggled with. But I was hoping that it would make the opportunity for a different body type that they would put out in a figure because it's very limiting in your collection to have just plain looking figures like all the same body types. Now, I'm sure to the women who are getting a figure made of themselves that are looking, uh, they would much rather have this sort of you know gigantic busted thin waist, um, you know very firm looking physique. But let's be honest, none of us can maintain that for very often. I'm sure if sorry ladies, but if you see Chris Hemsworth on the outtakes, he probably doesn't look as good as when the cameras are rolling. So yeah, but I was hoping that they would make a different version of Princess Leia or a different body for Princess Leia, um, as she would like naturally appear. And but unfortunately, they even covered up her neck with a high collar so that uh, it was sort of idealized, basically. Um, and you couldn't see any of the, for lack of a better word, we'll just call it the turkey waddle you get in the neck. Like as we age, our necks just sort of lose their elasticity and the skin sags a bit. And you can see when you see an actress or a Hollywood celebrity, um, that the neck kind of tells the story. You can Botox and facelift and things like that, but the neck is very, very difficult to lie with. And um, you can kind of tell who is basically how old just by looking at the neck, because the elasticity just isn't there. Skin gets a little loose, and which I think aging gracefully to some extent is uh, a good thing. I think that there's a lack of appreciation. I remember when I was in college, um, because I was paying for college myself without any kind of financial aid or anything like that. I had to wait until I had the money to pay for classes before I would take the classes. And so as a result, I would try to go to full time as much as I could. But there were several semesters there that I was just going part time as I could afford it. And I realized that people in the classes that I was taking were like, there were girls in there that were 18 years old, and there I was at like 21. And when you're um, 21 years old, there's a huge difference between a 21-year-old and an 18-year-old. The the awareness, the life experience, and it would have been like shooting fish in a barrel. And I took this girl out to lunch one day, um, after drawing class. Really, really pretty girl. But we went over to Pizza Hut, and about, before our order even got there, I realized, like, wow, I have nothing at all to talk to this girl about. She comes from a completely different world than me. Um, Her parents have kind of paid for everything in her life, and you know, uh, my parents were able to kind of tell me good luck, and that's about it. I mean, so I was about like 20, 21 years old, and well, 3 years later, both my parents would be dead. So um, I guess it's a good thing that they taught me how to, like, you know make it on my own. But yeah. So you see how, let's see, measure this up here. Okay, belly button's going to be right about here. So yeah, there's a distinct difference there, and like you try talking to somebody that much younger than you at that age, even at that age, really. Um, as you get older, the age barrier decreases quite a bit. You can talk to someone who's 5, 6, even like my parents were like 9.5 years apart. Um, but by the time they got together, my mom was in her 30s and my dad was 40, so um, it wasn't too different. So okay, how's that looking? So um, but yeah, it was interesting to see how just a difference in age and having a conversation with somebody. I mean, yeah, different background and stuff like that. Like, so, but anyway, I realized, like, yeah, I'm not going to have anything in common with this girl. So that was the last time we went to lunch. Um, but we were still pretty friendly throughout the rest of the semester. Okay, now, um, yeah, Tim, I went to community college too. I was, by the time my senior year rolled around in high school, I was the youngest. My parents were busy getting divorced. um, I was a little distracted by the idea of where I was going to live. So my grades kind of slipped a bit. So yeah, it was interesting. Okay. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to start touching up the top of the torso so that I can get an estimate of where ideally the breasts are. And then we'll start to see how gravity beats us up. Okay. Now what I'm doing here is I'm making this in halves. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll get the first part done, smooth it all out, put in all the lines, wrinkles, and things like that I want. And again, this doesn't have to be perfect because I'm not going to be putting this in a bikini or anything like that. So it's not going to be, the whole purpose of this is for the model, the figure, to have sort of a representation underneath the clothes, a realistic representation underneath the clothes. So you'll see the protrusions, the rolls, things like that. If on the places where the outfit will fit tight enough. Most importantly, it's going to be the neck. So we're going to see like age, and we're going to see some of those effects on there. No, Tim, you like some bikini chick figures. I don't think that there's too many people out there that are like, I'm sure there's some, and if that's your taste, fine. But you have to recognize you're in the minority if you want to see Lizzo in a bikini. Most people are probably not going to do that. And it's not a sexist thing because let's be honest, um, the women that are going to line up to go see Chris Hemsworth, for all intents and purposes, naked in Thor: Love and Thunder, would not line up to see Jack Black in the same outfit or lack of outfit. So, I mean, you think about it, they would never ever think of doing that scene where, Thor's clothes get like vanished off of him and the women are standing there ogling him. You're not going to see that same uh, uh, treatment go to any female character. So, yes, some figures in bikinis, yes. And unfortunately, this is not going to be this one. It's going to be kind of, there's going to be some drooping action. There's going to be uh, some sagging and some wrinkling and things like that, which is fine because as you start to age, you learn. You know what? I'm either going to have to adjust my um, perceptions or be very, very lonely. I had a friend of mine who, well, he was a boss of mine and thought he was my friend. Turns out, yeah, not so much. But he was at the time 54 years old, and his girlfriend was about 15 years younger than him. And and they had been together for quite some time. He said he finally broke it off, and she was quite upset with him. And uh, because he was breaking off their relationship, but he said to her, I'm 15 years older than you. And she's like, I don't care. He's like, well, you don't care now. And I look good at 54, but there's no such thing as a good looking 75-year-old man. So he, which I guess is kind of an accurate statement. Like it's sort of, you know, you're you can look good for your age, but you don't look good. It's like, um, but at the same time, you have to think to yourself, like, you know, uh, that's people find, each other in different stages of your life, and you know, you find that like sometimes it's more important to actually connect with a person rather than just like what um, the exterior is holding up. So um, I don't know. I don't know. But considering that we seem to be having an outbreak in this country of STDs in nursing homes, I I would suggest that like clearly people have found a way past the beauty standards of our youth. Okay, so we're going to go in here like this. Now, a couple of things I'm going to do here, um, because I want to have this. My goal is to have the upper torso be used in several instances. So I'm going to have one lower torso that looks kind of like this. But then what I'm also going to do is make another one, another lower torso that's a little more Rosie O'Donnellish. It's going to be a little bit more, a little heftier, a little bit more um, substantial, shall we say? Um, see, as I sculpt this in here, you see how the weight of the breast kind of draws down here a little bit, like this. It's funny, my friend there was had the younger girlfriend. He said to me, gravity isn't only cruel to women; it's also cruel to men. He's like, it's a very disturbing thing one day when you wake up and you realize that your scrotum is hanging lower than your shaft. And I'm like, you know, this is not the conversation I really wanted to be having at work. But hey, it's those things that you pick up along the way. As you get older, you're like, oh yeah, I remember when Don said that to me. Okay, so there's the first part and how this is gonna sit. Now, clearly, what I'm gonna have to do is thin out or thicken up the upper rib cage here on my lower torso to get like that. Now, like every other sculpture that I do, this has to get into a position where you have to let it sit for a couple days, and you um, look at it with fresh eyes, so you can judge symmetry, and you can look at uh, the the lay of the land. So if you're looking at these um, and you're actively working on it, you will study the positioning. You'll really look at things. Oh yeah, that's a little bit much. Okay. Um, and what you'll see is things that you had mistakes that you had overlooked, and you'll look at things like a natural flow. Once I get the upper and lower half of the torso done on this, what I'll do from there is I will pop it in the oven and cure it once I get it the way I want. And once it's cured, I will use the hardened sculpture. Then I'll sculpt on the back half of the body. So once the back half of the body's done, then I can work on making the mold. Now, what I'm probably going to end up doing is making an alginate mold because I'm going to cast this in silicone, so it's a very flexible bodysuit, basically. And pull this in here like this. A little concentration here. Okay, so I'll be using an alginate for the mold, for the initial mold anyway. Because I'm going to be casting this in silicone. I'll be using platinum silicone that retains a lot of its flexibility even after it's been cured. Okay, like that, and there, and there. No, Tim. No, I'm not lonely, but it does remind me of a song, a wonderful song from Team America World Police. I'm so lonely, so sad and lonely. What a great movie that is. I would love to watch Team America World Police in a theater with modern audiences, just so I could watch some of them be horrified. It's kind of funny with you look at like when I look at the TV shows that I grew up with, my God, like today's generations could not even deal with it. They would have to be offended just on reflex alone. And you put these people in a room and you put Archie Bunker on a video and watch them lose their minds about the things he would say. Then you put George Jefferson on the other side. Then they'd really be confused because, like, I can't criticize him because he's a black man. Yeah, guess what? George Jefferson and Archie Bunker were the same guy. They're both bigoted, uh, hardened by their life experiences, and ultimately, gradually, reluctantly, they would sometimes soften their viewpoints, which is pretty much what happens all the time. It's funny growing up in this area here. I remember when I was in sixth grade, I was the only white kid at my friend Tyler's party. We were we were the only two nerdy kids that would sit there and draw comic books in school in class. I was sort of fortunate because I had my two older brothers that were active. I guess you would call them bodybuilders, like or they were lifting weights with the ambition to bodybuild. We'll say that. And so yeah, it was uh, it was interesting. And it's funny because my parents were older. Uh, I had the oldest parents around. My mom was 34 years old when I was born, and my dad was 43. And so my parents were like older than everybody else's parents. And I remember one time I was on a uh, internet forum on Star Wars and things like that. And there was this girl on there, and she started going off on Captain America and how racist and sexist his generation was, which I had to inform her that she was talking at her ass and she had no idea what she was talking about. At which time she informed me like how long she had been like in college, and like she had studied like all about that generation, and how like racist and sexist and probably homophobic they all were. So I was like, no, it sometimes might have been like that, but I was actually raised by two people of that generation, and they weren't like that. In fact, my dad had a pretty amusing story. Um, when my dad was born in 1924, and back in the 50s, they had a friend who was a singer, and she couldn't get a gig booked anywhere. Till one day, she booked her first gig, and she went to all of her friends, like, "Hey, can you come out and support me for my first show?" And everybody was like, "Yeah," until they found out it was a gay bar. So my dad and one of their friends, were the only ones that showed up. And my dad said, "You know, I've never been hit on so much in my whole life. It got to a point where I had to sit here and hold hands with a 250-pound plumber so guys would stop hitting on me." But he gave his kids some good advice there. He said, "Now listen, if you're out somewhere, and now my dad was a big guy. My dad was 6 foot tall and hadn't been below 200 pounds since he was 18 years old. No, my dad was not gay." um, but he was 6 foot tall and uh, at least 200 pounds. He was 250 pounds for, up until the end of his life. Last few months of his life, cancer had kind of dropped his weight down. Um, but he said to me, he's like, "Listen, if you're out somewhere and somebody who's gay comes up and hits on you or anything like that, you just very politely say, uh, oh no, I wasn't even conceived up at that point. This is like back in the 1950s. This was like when it was like very much taboo." Although my dad was friends with a guy, he was a local comedian here named Cozy Morley, and um, back then, uh, Atlantic City was a big deal. Atlantic City was like a very happen in place. So a lot of the entertainment would kind of like they would play in Philadelphia and they would also play in Atlantic City. And so my dad would often get tickets to go see Cozy Morley. And he when they were in town, there was like because they were Philadelphia is pretty close to New York, you would get a lot of interaction between a lot of the comics that would play in New York because back then New York was actually much bigger in entertainment than Hollywood was, or at least just as big, especially for live performances. Um, so um, when the news came out about Rock Hudson having AIDS, um, my dad was like, because everybody back then when it was like nobody could believe that Rock Hudson was gay. My dad was like, Jesus, he used to hear these stories from his friends, like, whenever Rock Hudson would be in Atlantic City, like he was chasing everything in a pair of pants. He was like the biggest slut around. He was so. But anyway, back to the original point. Like my dad said, listen, if some guy ever propositions or anything, just say to him very politely, no, not into that, not my thing. Whatever you do, don't go getting smart because they're pretty friggin' tough. They uh they've been fighting all their lives and they know how to fight and you get your ass handed to you pretty quickly. Um and it was funny because like when I was in college, uh when I was in college, we would go over to South Street in Philly and a lot of artists hung out on South Street. Um, you had a lot of punk rock going on there. A lot of there were some art houses and things like that. And every week you would see some suburban kids coming in there, and they would think that they were going to they thought that gay people were pushovers and stuff, and they would go in there and think that they were going to push them around. And a little while later, you'd see these guys, these kids that would come in from the suburbs, thinking they're tough, looking all bruised up and bleeding after they just found out how tough they weren't. And of course, I'm sure when they got home, the stories were about, how they got jumped or something like that. Not that, you know, they got beat up by a couple of gay people in the city. Yeah, there we go. Okay, now I'm gonna have to work this neck a little bit. This is gonna be tricky because I don't want it to look too um, uh, too thick because I'm trying to express age with it. There's some wrinkles and some uh, thinness. Because of course, as we age, the musculature drops a little bit. But I want this upper torso to be indicative of. It could be for a know thicker lady or it's kind of thin but just older. Cutting in these vertical and horizontal wrinkles. Kind of go into the skin here. Yeah, the neck is the truth teller. And get some of these interlacing wrinkles as well. You know, just kind of come up there. Okay, we want to put in a little bit of detail here. Like so. Okay, I'm going to have to dig this out a little bit here too, because this is where the shoulder kind of ties in. And you want to see how, like on the model here, you can see how the breast curves in, and it gives you just a little bit of indication of where it comes in to join the shoulder. Now here's the area where we're going to want to tie in some wrinkles and some stretch marks that come down to here. We also want to put in like a couple lines of fat going this way, because like that's where fat would naturally be deposited at. And another thing we're going to work on is like the nipple placement. Remember one time we were having we were at a friend's house drinking, and my friend's wife, we were talking about like, you know, youth and stuff like that, and she lamented, I used to have such nice perky boobs, then I had kids, now I have National Geographic titties. Just kind of funny. It's something that, like, you know, only women really think about so much. Although the fact of the matter is that, you know, most of the men kind of look National Geographic men as well. Okay, so I'm cutting this in here like this, and I'm going to go here and bring this up a little bit like that. Now here, I don't want this to be quite so severe, so I'm going to trim a little bit. Pop that off here. And I'll take this guy and just sort of push it up and around, so it sort of suggests a little bit of a flow around like that. You know, so this sculpture ends up representing someone who is like in their late 60s, who happens to be in charge of Star Wars. Oops. Okay, so also what I want to do is apply a little bit of a stretch mark and some stretch lines to the breast itself. And for that, I want this very specific tool that I like to use, like this. It's like a big hook. And I'm kind of pushing a little bit hard. When I go over this with a brush with some alcohol on it, it will soften these lines considerably. So they look kind of harsh and severe here, but once you hit it with the alcohol, it really softens them and makes them look a lot more natural. Yeah, cutting this line in here reminds me of the time we went to a bachelor party and we went to a strip club. And I never really liked strip clubs. I always felt kind of dirty in them. Not because, the scenery is certainly great, but there's always that one guy in there who was just staring off at these girls as he's peeling off dollar bill after dollar bill, and you could just see it's kind of pathetic how he's you can kind of see in his mind, and he's thinking to himself, yeah, she really digs me. And like, buddy, when you run out of ones, she's going to be talking to somebody else. But hey, whatever gets you through the night. Yeah, see, so I'm hoping that this will be able to double as a like a crone or a witch, as well as just like basic like middle-aged woman kind of thing. Like I said, there's options out there if you want to have a a figure that's representative of a middle-aged man. In fact, when Hot Toys did their Samuel L. Jackson Nick Fury figure, he actually comes with a little bit of a fat suit inside to give him sort of a little paunch there. So okay, so I think I'm going to wrap it up, but that's the base for what I'm trying to do to get this. So it's two-part model that will eventually look like this one here. That will go on the endoskeleton. Endoskeleton of the endoskeleton of the female model, kind of like that. All right, I think I'm gonna close up shop and hit the sack. For those of you who tuned in or are going to tune in and watch, thank you very much. I appreciate it. If you have any questions about my techniques, ramblings, anything like that, possible suggestions, things I can improve, I would be really interested in hearing it. Have a great night, everyone.